folks, I think, know, have been following in the news that the legislature decided that they wanted to act really quickly on taking up police reform measures to address, issues of police brutality that have been in the news, and it's sort of beyond time to make these changes. We actually started off having conversations internally. And if you'll remember, we as an agency have already taken a position in support of the Massachusetts Black and Latino Legislative Caucus platform. But we, at the same time, were having conversations with our metro mayors and some mayors and managers in the North Shore Coalition, and had been basically working on a pledge among those mayors and managers, which I actually think we are, in fact, I know we are rolling out later this week, I think early this week, in the next day or so. As through those conversations with mayors and managers, we sort of refined some of the positions that we were hearing from them. And when the Senate rolled out their police reform bill, we offered some comments essentially on behalf of those mayors and managers, reflecting those conversations that we'd been having. And I should just also note that Adam, in his capacity not as vice president at MAPC, but as a very strong member of the Metro Mayors Coalition, was very, very helpful in those conversations and really refining the position of the mayors and managers, putting a really fine point on it. But as Rebecca and Mark both indicated, Mark Fine and Diego really did the yeoman's work of digging into what was inside the Senate bill and what wasn't. And so we have really been kind of honing in on that to take a position of the agency that would sort of build on what is inside the Massachusetts Black and Latino Legislative Caucus. So the Senate did actually vote on their police reform bill last week. They passed it. And as Rebecca noted, the House came out with their version of a police reform bill late last night. I think they pulled it last night, and I think it hit the news wires today that the bill was released. I have not had a chance to dig into the bill, but I think Mark and Diego have done some work very early this morning to kind of look into the contents of that piece. So I'm going to turn it over to them to sort of walk through the highlights of what was in and what weren't in the Senate bill, because that sort of forms the backbone of the position that we would like this body, the agency, to take to offer our perspective about what we think should be in any forthcoming proposal. So I'm going to turn it, I'm looking down at my screen to Mark and Diego, whoever wants to kick it off.
Sure, I can kick off like what was in the Senate bill, and then Mark, if you don't mind tackling kind of what wasn't. And then I'm also happy to just quickly talk about afterwards, like the House, since I actually think the House is a pretty robust bill based off just a quick scan of the bill. So I guess like the first thing in terms of like what was in the Senate, I'm kind of just going through my notes here. One of the big recommendations from the Black and Latino Legislative Caucus was to create a POST, which is a police officer kind of certification committee. I don't recall like what the POST stands for, but the Senate basically creates POSAC, which is the Police Officer Standards and Accreditation Committee, which is really in charge of standardizing, credentialing, and decertifying police officers. And so this commission will kind of come up with the recommendations that police officers will need to use in order to become a police officer in the Commonwealth, which again was one of the core recommendations of the Black and Latino Legislative Caucus. A big piece of the bill too was they did adopt clear statutory limits on use of force by police officers, which falls in line again with the recommendations from the caucus, as well as some of these national projects like 8 Can't Wait, and I think it's Vision Zero, if I'm calling correctly. One of the recommendations from the Legislative Caucus as well was to create some kind of commission on structural racism. So the Senate nor the House actually include that per se, but they do create different types of commissions, such as the Commission on African Americans, which will kind of look at some of these structural and racial discrepancies. The Senate bill did create a commission for Latinx, with the similar goals. The Senate bill also does require that police officers be trained on the history of racism in the United States, lynching, and racist structural institutions as well. So while it's not necessarily a commission on structural racism, there are components of that kind of concept throughout the bill. And I think like those were the big pieces that I think we were really supportive of in the Senate bill. So I'll actually turn it over to Mark to kind of talk about some of the kind of decertification pieces and I guess the collective bargaining piece.
Sure. Hi, all. Well, yeah, I mean, I think as Diego points out, I mean, at the center of all the pieces of legislation that are moving is the notion of certifying police officers. You know, and there are some nuances to the way the governor approached it versus the Senate's approach. And I think, you know, in a quick look at the House, you know, they also have a slightly different approach too. But at the heart, they're all looking to certify police officers, you know, based on kind of a set of consistent standards, you know, and training that all police officers would need to take to be appointed to the role. And I guess you know, and I think we all see that as a positive thing. I think the concern, you know, that we've had in the bill in part is, you know, what is the meaning of certification? And I think especially if certification, you know, where you create processes potentially to revoke or decertify officers, what does that actually entail as to their continued employment, you know, going forward with their local appointing authorities or their local police departments? And I think the concern is in a way with, and I haven't been able to look at the House closely enough, but both in the Senate and in the governor's bills, that, you know, the certification was clear, but it's really not certain what happens after. Oh, sorry, I got a loud dog barking, but you know, certification's it's not clear that that would lead to you know, employment action at the local level, and what would and whether actually it would you know, make it easier for local communities to dismiss officers who are found you know, to have you know, been guilty of misconduct. So I think that's one of the big issues that we wanted to see tightened up, and we recommended that the House build on what the Senate's done by, you know, making certification, you know, not just a condition of appointment, but then also you know, enabling revocation of that to lead to employment action and stronger action. I mean, it does get tricky. I think collective bargaining agreements, it's not clear that legislation can just, you know, summarily overturn or overrule what's in a collective bargaining agreement. So I think that's a tough spot, but the bill should certainly make it explicit that an officer that has lost certification can no longer actively serve in a law enforcement capacity. So we've asked for that to happen as one of the major areas to build on. And I guess I just touch on, you know, a few other areas. I mean, another, you know, major issue is the recruitment and hiring of police officers, which is largely done through the civil service system. You know, and it's an exam, and communities are then handed a list of potential candidates, and they basically have to hire off the list. And I think a lot of communities have found that to really limit their options. And if they certainly want to, you know, hire a broader range of potential police officers, including, you know, more candidates of color, the civil service list system hasn't necessarily enabled that to happen. So, you know, some communities have started to withdraw from the civil service system. It is somewhat of a process. Usually, I think with the civil service system, you have to, the way you leave it is basically the way you came into the system. So in some cases, you would need home rule legislation to actually, you know, be adopted to do that. But in recent years, about 17 police departments have left the civil service system, and 4 fire departments, I think 5 actually now, have left the civil service system. And, you know, what we called for was just to make it easier for all communities that want to leave the civil service system by just either a majority vote of their town meeting or their, you know, city council. So, you know, we'd like to, you know, we think there's, you know, some merit in communities considering that step, and we think the legislature should make it easier for them to do that. So that's another piece that wasn't addressed, but we would like to see that addressed either in this legislation or in further legislation. And I guess, you know, when you get to just discipline processes and disciplinary proceedings at the local level, you know, a lot of that gets bogged down in arbitration, which can take a long time and often lead to not necessarily the result communities were hoping for after, you know, years of cost and you know, process. So we did call for, you know, reforms being made to the arbitration process within collective bargaining agreements. And, you know, that's something I don't believe you know, either of the legislation has touched on. It's a real, you know, difficult subject to grasp just because of the union opposition. But that's another thing we call for. And I think lastly, I just point out to, what happens when an officer is found to have used illegal force in their work. They can lose their certification under the bills if they have, if there's a complaint made that they use illegal force, and then they, and then if the Standards and Accreditation Committee sustains that complaint, they can be decertified for that. But then what happens? I mean, if it's illegal use of force, potentially is a crime. And I think what we're asking for is that, at the least that these, such complaints be referred to an independent prosecutor for potential prosecution. So, clearly if a serious crime has been committed, an independent prosecutor should consider whether they should explore charges. So that's another thing we're calling for in the legislation. And, I feel as if those are the four main kind of prongs of this. But I think the biggest fear with some of what's happening is you create a new committee and it doesn't necessarily, ease the burden or make it, make it less difficult for local communities to, get rid of officers that have a track record of misconduct. I think that's the, kind of at the nub of the issue. And how, if you can't do that, how, strong really is certification as a measure of accountability. So those are what we've been looking at and had written to the House to include. And I'm glad to answer questions on any of it and all of it.
And I'll just add really quickly, Mark. So again, this is just off a quick scan of the House bill this morning. So they're actually, Mark, Rebecca, Adam, and Mayor Spicer, we actually spoke with Rep. Cronin. She's the chair of Judiciary last week to talk about some of these concerns. And actually one of the things that I did find in the bill was that they do create a special commission to look at civil service exams at both the municipal level, the state police level, and the municipal level. So I think that's a really good step that at least there's a push to study these things. And I guess what the things they'll be looking at are hiring, recruitment, promotion, collective bargaining agreements, and disciplinary appeals. So I think that's one really good step in the House bill. Just the two other things that I'd mention is the House bill also does require that the state kind of, there is like a national decertification database. So it actually requires that the state cooperate with these other states to make sure that a police officer from Massachusetts isn't recruited, in another state and likewise. And then just the last thing, it does require, there's a kind of along the lines of what decertification means, although it's really unclear, but it requires that municipalities report to one of the commissions any complaints that have been filed so far from police, any police officer complaints, which again, to kind of Mark's point, is a little unclear like what that'll actually lead to, but at the very least is, I think good indication that the House is taking this seriously. So I'll kind of stop there and, like Mark said, see if anybody has any questions.
Sandra, do you have a question?
I guess my question was, since neither bill included some of the things that we really wanted and both have passed, is my understanding that, is there any chance that any of these would be added, or is that just a further step?
The House just released their bill last night. It hasn't gone to the floor yet.
Okay,
So we will.
amended.
So we will be pressing for these issues mainly in the House and then in conference.
I see. Oh, I see. Release the bill. I thought you said pass the bill. Okay, release the bill. I see. Okay, thanks. Sorry.
And I think the other piece to answer that, Sandra, is that, on the civil service piece, as Diego said, I don't necessarily know if we would have been able to accomplish complete civil service reform in this quick of a time frame. And so the House, I don't know if they listened to us or they were already planning on doing it, but having the commission in there, I think is an important step forward. And on the collective bargaining side, I would just remind everyone that, the reforms to the collective bargaining around health insurance that we pursued probably took in the end between 7 to 10 years to come to fruition. Hopefully we will be successful in a shorter time frame, but I think the big issue is like, how do we keep those on the table and part of the conversation and ensure that this isn't the only kind of, so-called bite at the apple, but that we continue to figure out ways to look at opportunities for reform.
Sam?
I just, first of all, congrats on a lot of good work. It sounds like this is a first step in a much bigger, in a bigger process, in a longer process. And I'm curious what your assessment is of the energy going forward. I mean, I wonder if once this gets done, people will be like, okay, we've done it. We don't want to go back to that issue for a while, like 15, 25 years. What's your take on that?
Well, there's an interesting article in the New Yorker a few weeks ago, which I would suggest people read, about commissions on race relations going back to the 1800s. Most challenging was a quote from 1919, which, if you replace the word Negroes either with the word blacks or African Americans, would read identically word for word from what you can expect from a commission in modern times. So I think that, one always needs to approach this kind of a situation with a certain kind of sense of balance and concern about whether or not even the commissions that are being established are little more than an effort to kind of wait out the public anger, so that no serious change needs to be taken. All that said, I think we have a historic obligation, all of us, to take advantage of every opportunity that arises to try and move things forward toward justice. And we should try and accomplish as much as we can in this legislation, and not be patient to wait, but always try and accomplish as much as we can this session, this year. Some things will be accomplished by the 31st of July, hopefully. They say they're coming back in the fall only to do the budget, but I suppose it's conceivable they might do a few other things. And then the next session begins immediately. So that's our job. Our job is to keep moving it forward during the times when people are paying an enormous amount of attention to this work. And it is also our job to keep moving it forward, to keep rattling the can, so to speak, to keep drawing people's attention to these issues, even when it's not on the front page of the news every day. And that's what we're going to do. We're not, it would have been very easy to be satisfied with the Senate bill. Honestly, the Senate bill was pretty good. I know nothing about the House bill. I'm learning about it on this call, to be perfectly honest. But we will just, the whole focus of the item we're putting before you is to say, no, we're not going to be satisfied. There are additional things that are not in this bill. Some of them will probably not be in the House bill. And we are going to try and let everybody know that meaningful reform requires these elements.
Go ahead.
I also think, we did start some of this work as an agency under State of Equity. And it was something Mark Fine, Diego and I worked on kind of in like the very tail end of working on State of Equity before we released it. It was some of the trickiest stuff that we were working on because it was a bit new to the agency. But I'd say, between that work, this effort right now, and even under Metro Common, I do also think that some of this effort does kick off kind of a longer set of research. Folks remember, actually, I'm not sure if folks on this call remember, but we had been doing for a while with the Metro Mayors Coalition some work around JLMC. And we had done some really good work kind of compiling what was happening with JLMC, but things shifted inside the building and it actually made it hard to move forward legislatively. But I do actually feel like it sort of kicks off some ongoing work that I expect us to keep doing. And I think, not unlike what Mark is saying, but sort of to put a finer point on it, I think it is now part of our responsibility to make sure that we continue to tell the story of what's challenging with this issue inside the State House and in the media, so that we are actually part of the reason that there's a drumbeat that's kept up on this. I also think that there are a number of folks inside the building right now that are committed to using this opportunity as a first step, but then will also continue to take it forward into the next legislative session.
So if I could just add a follow-up comment and then I'll shut up because I know I talk a lot. So subject I know nothing about, but my impression is that civil service is a result of a kind of 19th century patronage problem that urban cities had as a way of dealing with, I'm going to hire my cousin, though he knows nothing about policing. And that underlying condition may have changed somewhat over the last 100 and some odd years. And it might be a way of attacking or addressing that issue to say that the underpinnings of the problem are different now. And it might be a way of kind of addressing civil service. I want to also just throw in one specific. I heard the police chief here in Cambridge say one of his things he was surprised by was that any disciplinary action, a problem an officer runs into is a public issue and can get reported in the news and people know about it as community discussion. Any disciplinary action by law, according to him, by state law, is private and not available to be shared publicly. I don't know if that's accurate, but it was one of the things that he found kind of confounding about being a police chief in Cambridge was any action he takes against an officer cannot be told back to the community. We took this action, we did this person was disciplined in this way. So I just share that from a public dialogue that we
Yeah, Sam, and I think like both the House and Senate bills actually create a database where somebody can like go and look up complaints, and I don't actually know if disciplinary actions is listed as one of those, but I imagine it is if they're making, you know, complaints public and so on. So I do think the part of that is trying to be addressed.
Okay.
Yeah, well, because in a sense, the police officer standard and accreditation committee, I mean, that it provides a new channel for people to make complaints. So it doesn't have to, you know, if something happens in Cambridge, you know, and an officer is involved, then it doesn't have to just go through Cambridge. A citizen could make the complaint directly, you know, to this new committee. And, you know, that committee's findings are going to be public. So in a sense, I think people have long felt that it's very hard to ask individual police departments to police their own in a way. And, you know, they're in collective bargaining and other legal elements kind of make that hard. But I think that's why you create this kind of independent committee that enables complaints to be made there, enables investigation, and it has some real teeth for investigation. You know, and public hearing and potentially then public findings and, a complaint being sustained. So that does potentially give a channel for those things to happen outside of local departments. But so I think that's one positive thing about what they're doing.
Yeah. And my last, because I always talk too long, officers who have serious issues against them and then get hired by other departments. That sounds like a really bad situation. Okay, I'm done talking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also like the committee's meant to try to handle that because this would all be, you know, this standards and accreditation committee. I mean, that would all be public if they had, you know, misconduct claims that were sustained, and, you know, the database Diego talks about would be public. So departments could, you know, would definitely be able to see that and find whether that was the case with an officer. But I think, you know, like a lot of these things, it's going to matter, one, who's appointed, who's, you know, whether you have kind of agents of reform who are members of the committees, you know, and some of that's going to be in the hands of the governor and the other appointing authorities to these committees. And then, you know, whether they're staffed appropriately and given, you know, real, you know, kind of, you know, so the ability to really follow through on investigations thoroughly. I think that's a key thing. And, you know, we'll have to kind of watch out to see how that plays out.
So we are seeking officer approval for this so we can move forward. I don't know if Keith has anything he wants to say.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I would just mention that the Legislative Committee had a regular monthly meeting last Wednesday and reviewed this whole subject with staff. Of course, we had not seen the House version at the time, but the tenets that we supported are as set forth in the memo. And I believe it was, there were no dissenting votes of the committee. It was unanimous. I don't recall if there were abstentions. All those who were voting were in favor. So we are very supportive of MAPC taking a leadership role on this issue. Thanks.
Thanks, Keith. So someone from staff, can I have the exact ask for the officers?
Well, the ask is that that the officers endorse our memo regarding Senate, is it 2800? Have I got the number right? Yes,
It is, the House bill is now 2820, but same
and
bill.
seek to accomplish in the House bill and through conference those elements that are outlined in the memo.
So moved.
Motion made by Adam,
Second,
second made by Sam. Any comments? Sandra?
Did we see this memo?
Well, yes, you haven't seen it except probably when you were asleep, Sandra, because I'm afraid that I sent it out very late yesterday to all of the officers and to Keith.
Okay.
Or to be perfectly honest, I think it was this morning already. It outlines, I think, faithfully what Mark and Diego described in terms of our key priorities.
1241.
Sorry.
That's
No.
okay. I mean, that you're working at that hour is crazy, so thank you.
It gives me a chance to go to the beach during the day, Sandra. Don't feel too badly for me.
Well,
Whatever
I
works.
appreciate all your efforts and, yeah, we've had a
I mean, honestly, Leah, I think, sent this document to us on Friday, and partly because I was on vacation, I didn't notice it until there was a short discussion yesterday with Heidi about whether it should go out, and then I said, oh, I got to read it over. So you'll note that at the very bottom of that memo, the only thing I added to it was that at the legislative committee, a lot of members raised the flagging issue. And I just want to note to the officers that although that is something we've already endorsed, addressing that issue, and we will continue to work on it, it's not necessarily appropriate to raise it during this debate, which is really on somewhat other issues. But we aren't going to drop it. I think 3 or 4 members of the legislative committee raised that question. I wanted to make sure people knew we weren't ignoring it.
what is the issue, Mark?
It's just the issue of police details for road work.
Oh, okay.
Flaggers. Yeah. Okay, great. If there is no other questions from officers, we have to do roll call because that's what we do now. So Sam,
yes.
Sandra,
Yes.
Adam,
Yes.
and Aaron says yes. Unanimous. Motion passes.
Thank you very much.
No,
And
thank you.
Thanks
Next.
to Mark and Diego and Rebecca and Lizzie, obviously, but
Yes.
for a lot of work on this issue. Ready to move on to the next item?
Yes, please.
So I'm going to turn this over to Diego. I'm going to give him a minute to get ready simply by saying that what we are doing here is also a matter that went through legislative committee on Wednesday. And as you know, we worked hard, many others worked much harder on the eviction and foreclosure ban, the temporary eviction and foreclosure ban. I prefer to call it forbearance rather than a ban. We are now facing a cliff as early as the 18th of August when these rents and mortgage payments will be due. For homeowners, it's a little less severe because they can put the unpaid balance to the end of their term. But for renters, the amount will be fully due and payable, and at the time that the ban ends. And that is particularly difficult in light of the fact that many of the federal subsidies are coming eventually to an end. They may be extended, but we don't want to be completely dependent upon what happens in Washington. So this is a bill that has been put forward, and we would like to endorse it, but with limitations, because we're not sure that every single part of it is either adequate or correct. And so we have in the memo, we have a series of items that we would like to work toward adding to the bill to make it a stronger and probably more workable piece of legislation. With that, I'll turn it over to Diego to talk in a little more detail about the legislation.
All right, thanks, Mark. So I want to say it's pretty self-explanatory, especially since it's in essence an extension of what the officers already endorsed back in March with the initial moratorium. So, I will say, like, just the one thing is I believe I'm blanking on the word now, but August 16th is I guess the deadline for when the first version of the moratorium ends, if you will. So by that, the governor, I think, has been very unclear as to whether or not he'll extend that moratorium, which he has the ability to do, or not. And so what this bill would do is it would continue that moratorium for 12 months from whenever the public health emergency is lifted, not necessarily when the first moratorium is lifted. So, again, a reminder, it'll prevent, or not prevent, but it'll kind of put a pause on any foreclosure or eviction proceedings in the court. The two new pieces, if you will, I think that are good in this bill are it does create a housing stability and recovery fund. And so this money is meant to kind of go to the small landlords, which is something that MAPC had advocated for in the first iteration of the moratorium. One of the things that MAPC and the legislative committee recommends is that the legislature actually name how they're going to fund this new fund, which again will go to small landlords, and I think is really important. But given the budget projections, any clarity on how much money and how it would be funded, I think would be really good for the bill. And then I guess just the other piece that the legislative committee recommended was to incentivize some kind of payment plans between tenants and their landlords, because it's really there is no kind of language that says how some of this, I guess, arbitration, to use that word again, would happen. And so the legislative committee recommended including some language about that to kind of provide some more clarity and protections for tenants, because obviously we all know that if you were laid off and you start your job in 2 weeks, you're not going to necessarily have all that payment that you might have missed in those first 2 weeks. So I'll kind of pause there, and I'll kind of ask Lizzie if there's anything she wants to add.
The only thing I would just note is that there's been a lot of pressure on the governor within the past week or so to actually use his power under the first bill and extend the existing moratorium, and to announce that sooner rather than later. Just this weekend, I heard from just friends who work here in Medford and a friend who works in Malden that tenants were already being presumptively evicted in advance of the lifting of or an extension rather of the moratorium. So that is illegal, to be clear, but it is happening. And so there's been a lot of pressure on the governor from advocates, but then also the attorney general came out this weekend and indicated that she would urge the governor to actually announce an extension of the existing proposal. I think I will note, though, that I think it is worth still taking a position on this proposal that we have before you, because I do think it is another opportunity for us to weigh in with the legislature and urge them to create small landlord protections, because that is a very real issue. And so I think it is, even if the governor does actually extend the moratorium, which again, I am hopeful that he does that soon, because we are a little under a month out, that we would also continue to be able to weigh in with the legislature on some of these other provisions in this proposal.
And I guess I would add just a couple of things. First of all, to be perfectly honest, I think a reason for endorsing this legislation is to put pressure on the governor to extend the existing ban. I also feel that even if he does extend it by a certain period of time, a cliff is a cliff is a cliff. It may come on a different day, but it's still a cliff. And the only thing that makes it not a cliff is when people, A, are reemployed, and B, have been able to save up enough money to pay 2, 3, 4, 5 months of rent. And for many people, that's very difficult, especially since they were unemployed. And we have to remember that for a lot of people, particularly people who are undocumented, there were no extended unemployment benefits. There is no unemployment. There was no one-time payment. And those folks' rent is still due and payable. Another reality is that the The housing market has remained fairly strong. Nobody knows for sure if that will be the case, but for the most part, rents and sales prices have stayed strong. And that is a situation in which speculators will be going after buildings. And in order to sell your building to a speculator, you generally need to empty it of tenants. So there will be, tremendous pressure to evict people, even if they are reasonably good pays, in order to empty buildings and sell them on the speculative market, particularly in hotter neighborhoods. So, one of the items that's included in our list of suggested amendments is to work on the question of incentivizing, requiring, encouraging in a variety of different ways payment plans so that renters can gradually repay their debts rather than having to do it all on one day. And the legislative committee suggested that we add into that enhanced mediation between landlords and tenants to try and generate such payment plans. And so we added that to this memo.
Sandra?
So there's two issues, right? The negotiations with tenants to prevent evictions and then prevent foreclosures on small landlords. Is that fair?
Well, the foreclosure issue is on homeowners generally, the ban that was passed by the legislature, and this extension, should it pass, and any gubernatorial extension, should that come into play from an executive perspective, covers both homeowners and renters. In fact, it covers, I believe, commercial property as well, commercial leases. So, it's the foreclosure protection is not only for small landlords, although of course they might have mortgages too, but it is for any homeowner as well.
Okay. Keith, do you want to give us a little insight from the legislative committee?
Sure. We had a robust discussion, and the vote was to support the staff's recommendation. I would defer to Lizzie, but I think it was also unanimous.
Handful of Boston abstained, but other than that, it was unanimous.
Thanks.
Sam?
Just a quick question. There is some need to prove that it's because of COVID that you're in this situation, right? How hard is it? How hard are those? Is that hurdle?
So it doesn't, it actually, I actually haven't seen what the current DHCD regulations are for that, but this bill, again, kicks it to DHCD to create those regulations. Like a form that you have to fill out to prove it's COVID-19 related.
I was waiting for another question, Sam. No? Okay.
I'll stop myself.
Okay.
Stop me before I.
So any other question? Adam, do you have any questions?
Nope. Thank you, though. No.
Okay. Okay. So Mark or Lizzie, can I have the ask, please?
Well, it is that the office is endorsed using your emergency procedures, the recommendation from the legislative committee as described in the memorandum that you received at 12:41 this morning, and which I have, by the way, forwarded both memoranda to Heidi for the record.
So moved.
Motion made by Adam.
Second.
All right, second made by Sam. I'm looking down below because that's where you and Sandra are on my screen. Any other questions or comments? Great. This requires roll call. Sam?
Yes.
Sandra?
Yes.
Adam?
Yes.
Erin? Yes. Unanimously passed. Thank you. And thank you all again for all your work on this. I guess the question is there any other business not known at the time of the posting?
Not from me, I know that. So.
Great. All right, great. Adam?
I would just simply thank Mark and Rebecca and Lizzie and Diego and Mark Fine, the whole team who put together the diversity session last week. I thought that was a really powerful session that will hopefully continue to pay dividends as we try to do this equity work across the Commonwealth and the region. So thank you.
Thank you.
I agree.
Thank
I
you for
had
being a
my
last minute panelist.
Of course, my pleasure.
attendees had no idea he was last minute. So that's great. I had my human resources director on the call as well, and we had a nice conversation after. So that was really great.
Thanks, Aaron. That's
Yeah,
great.
I forwarded it to town manager in Bedford, and she said they were already had several people signed up. So
Yep. Great. So if there is no other business or compliments before the board, looking for one last motion.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn by Sam, second made by Adam. Any other comments? And also before we move that vote, I do want to thank Keith as well as the legislative chair for joining us this morning. I know you've missed
Happy
us,
to do
so
it. Happy to do it. I'm in the middle of a 9-day training on climate reality global training, 10,000 trainees. I'm one of 500 mentors, actually one of 25 lead mentors. And from our ranks, Jenny Raitt is getting training along with a lot of folks that we know. So
great.
thank you.
Great. Great. Roll call is required. Sam,
Yes.
Sandra,
yes.
Adam,
Yes.
and me. Yes, that means motion passes. Meeting is adjourned at 9:49 a.m. Stay cool, everyone, particularly those who are in hotter places. And have a great day. Oh, Sandra?
Aaron, we're adjourned until September. Is that, I mean, we're not meeting again until September.
That's correct.
That's
but
correct.
Correct.
The executive committee meets on the 29th of July, I believe at the usual time, which is 11:30.
Yep.
Lunch will be served as always.